Welcome, everyone, to WITSA's webinar on the World Trade Organization's 13th Ministerial Conference, or MC13. My name is Doug Johnson, and I'm with the Consumer Technology Association in North America. I currently chair WITSA's Global Public Policy Committee. Trade and e-commerce are enormously important to our industry. This webinar is an opportunity for WITSA members to learn more about what transpired on e-commerce and digital trade at MC13 in Abu Dhabi back in February, the context and the challenges around those negotiations, and what lies ahead, including MC14. Before I hand it over to Anders Halverson to introduce our two guest speakers, let me highlight just two things about WITSA's policy work in this area. First, WITSA has established principles on digital trade, including principles concerning non-discrimination, cross-border data flows, forced data localization, trade facilitation, and customs duties on electronic transmissions. You can read more about these and other WITSA policy positions on WITSA's website, witsa.org. Second, and specific to MC13, WITSA applauded the extension of WTO's customs duties moratorium on electronic transmissions, which was achieved earlier this year. Before this accomplishment, WITSA had joined about 200 other industry and business groups from about 130 countries in highlighting the negative impacts that would have occurred if countries had started imposing tariffs on electronic transmissions. Now, let me hand it over to Anders Halverson, WITSA's Vice President, Global Public Policy, to introduce our speakers and begin today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Doug. So again, my name is Anders Halverson. I'm Vice President for Global Public Policy at WITSA. And it's an honor here today to introduce the panelists. First, we got Ed Burtsma, who is the Vice President of International Trade at the Consumer Technology Association. Ed Burtsma is the Vice President for International Trade. He leads CTA's trade and supply chain policy and advocacy work with a strong focus on improving the international trade environment and global supply chains to strengthen the competitiveness of the U.S. consumer technology industry. Ed previously served as an international trade advocate for the American Chemistry Council and Information Technology Industry Council, and a trade negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and U.S. Department of Commerce. Ed obtained 2 master's degrees from the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna in Austria, where he was a Fulbright Fellow, and from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and has a bachelor's degree in the classics from the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Next, we got Mary Thornton, Vice President of Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association. She joined SIA in 2023, where she directs SIA's policy agenda and international competitiveness, trade, export control, supply chain, global market research, emerging markets, and regularly engages with the U.S. and foreign governments. She also serves as the Executive Committee for Beijing-based U.S. Information Technology Office, USITO, representing SIA and its members. Mary has a diverse background in technology, trade, supply chain, and security issues spanning the wide range of geographies. She previously led policy work on trade and economic security issues for Amazon Web Services and Texas Instruments. Mary served as a senior trade negotiator for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative from 2008 to 2018, where she worked to expand access and create export opportunities for U.S. companies in foreign markets through both various bilateral and multilateral fora, and successfully negotiated the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement at the WTO, which eliminated customs duties on hundreds of technology products from 80-plus countries. Mary also served as the U.S. Department of Commerce and Treasury. Mary earned a master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan and a bachelor's degree in political science and mathematics from Colgate University. So thank you both to both of you. Appreciate you having on. So at this webinar today, we will be, instead of having long presentations, we have developed a series of questions. These are divided into 3 categories: the process leading up to the 13th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, and then the outcomes from the ministerial, as well as the way forward towards the next ministerial, the Ministerial 2014. So on the screen here, you will see that I have a few questions. So to both of you. You can both answer them, or one of you can answer them. It's whatever you prefer, and in whichever order that you prefer. So let me begin with the first question. From the industry standpoint, what were the key priorities and preparation strategies leading up to the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference? What were the industry's expectations for the conference, and how did they align with the actual outcome? Ed, would you like to take a first stab at that?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Anders. Our number one priority going into WTO MC13 was the extension of the moratorium on customs duties and electronic transmissions. Just from a personal standpoint, I found that to be quite interesting because in past WTO ministerial conferences, there were a lot more offensive priorities for industry to advocate for. And for this ministerial conference, those priorities weren't present. Number one was getting something extended that had been extended many, many, many times in the past. And in the past, it was a lot easier. And for this WTO MC13, it was incredibly difficult. And Mary and I can walk everyone through that. But I'll say that because this was our sole priority going into MC13, we were prepared for 2 years. I mean, when MC12 concluded, we started the process of preparation for securing another renewal of the moratorium, the industry process for getting that renewed at MC13. And so that meant that we had to collaborate with many associations and companies here in the United States, but also globally, and build up support for the extension of the moratorium with industries in both developed and developing countries, and to have them make the argument for extension to their own governments. I will say that the expectation we had going into MC13 for getting this priority taken care of was relatively uncertain. Let's put it that way. We weren't confident that at the end of the day, the ministers were going to be able to extend this because of the severe opposition by certain governments from India and South Africa and Indonesia principally. And our lack of confidence also had to do with the less than robust support for the extension of the moratorium by political leaders in the United States. We knew that at the staff level in the U.S. government at USTR that we were going to get a lot of support, but there were certain statements that were made by the WTO ambassador for the United States. You weren't getting a lot of vocal support from the USTR. We weren't sure at the end of the day that the United States government was going to stand up for extension. And as it turned out, the extension went all the way down to the very last minute. And even after the extension was gavelled, so to speak, where the ministers made the decision to extend the moratorium, one economy came forward and said, we disagree with that, and we need to go back and unwind what was just agreed to. And that was Indonesia. And it was pretty much chaos at that point. And we understand that there were personal interventions made by the minister, Dr. Al-Zayudi from UAE with India, and then interventions with the Indonesian government. Dr. Ngozi herself had to intervene at various points. So it was not a pretty scene during the ministerial conference, particularly in the final moment. So I'd like to hear what Mary thought about the priorities and preparation strategies as well.
Sure. Well, thanks, Ander and Doug and to WITSA for inviting me. But before I jump into the intrigue and leading up to MC13, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce the Semiconductor Industry Association. So we were a DC-based association. We've been the voice of the semiconductor industry in the U.S. for over 45 years. And our member companies represent 99% of the U.S. industry by revenue. But we also represent roughly 2/3 of the global semiconductor ecosystem. And semiconductors is a very global industry. We've benefited tremendously from the WTO agreements and the certainty and predictability that the multilateral trading system has created. A longstanding priority for us and for our members has been to expand the WTO's information technology agreement, both getting more countries to join that agreement and getting more products covered. So the ITA, it was an agreement originally signed in 1996. It's incredibly important. It eliminated tariffs on semiconductors and a whole swath of other technology products. And then it was expanded in 2015, the product coverage. So the reason this agreement is so important is for especially now, and the efforts to get more countries on board, is that countries are competing right now to attract to attract semiconductor investment onto their shores. Countries like Vietnam, India, Mexico, Panama, Jordan. And it's going to be important for those governments to figure out how they can make their investment climates as conducive to incoming investments as possible, and that includes lowering the cost of entry for would-be semiconductor investors. And so, joining the ITA 1 and the ITA 2 agreements will be super important in that regard. And we've been advocating for this for a long time at the WTO in capitals. We would have loved for ITA expansion, geographic expansion, product expansion to be on the agenda for MC13. But as Ed said, the focus really for MC13 and even MC12, frankly, has been just to stop the WTO from moving backwards, from creating new barriers to trade as opposed to removing barriers to trade. So let me kind of pivot to what we were focused on for MC13, and like Ed and his membership, we were really focused on the moratorium. It's often called the e-commerce moratorium, but it's about so much more than just e-commerce. So policymakers typically don't think about chips when it comes to digital trade and data policies, but like many other industries, the free flow of data is critical to enabling physical semiconductor supply chains and other physical supply chains too. So leading up to the meetings in Abu Dhabi, SIA and our members were super focused on shoring up as much global support, including global South support, for renewing the WTO moratorium. And we joined hundreds of other groups around the world in signing a global industry statement to support renewal and really ultimately making the moratorium permanent, so we don't have to go through this process every 2 years of making the arguments again and going through the intrigue of last minute gaveling and the outreach and personal interventions that Ed described. But also, in the lead up, the semiconductor industry, we advocated extensively in DC with USTR, of course, but also in capitals in Southeast Asia, in the Western Hem, in India, to really make the case for why it was important to extend the moratorium. And we actually, as part of our World Semiconductor Council, which brings together industry leaders from the US, Europe, China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, we all sent a joint letter to the Indian government making the case for why it didn't make sense for India to oppose a moratorium, especially as they are very focused on attracting investment from our sector and building out their domestic semiconductor ecosystem. Really just doesn't make sense. Why would you want to impose more red tape for a sector where you're trying to strengthen their supply chains and attract investment? So that's a little bit of maybe more on the lead up to MC13 than what actually happened on the ground, and which you know, there was lots of excitement there. But you know, again, to say you know, we're hopeful that going forward, you know, we'll get into the outcomes of MC13, but we're hopeful that going forward, maybe we can shift the debate and shift the focus of discussion in Geneva to, I think the real mission of the WTO is to figure out how to facilitate trade and not erect more barriers.
Thank you very much, Mary. So going on to the second question in the process leading up to the ministerial, I think you guys have already answered some of this, but let me pose the questions and see if there's anything else to add. In what ways were the industries able to influence the agenda and the discussions at the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference? And what were some of the significant challenges that the industries faced during the negotiations? I mean, you already talked about some of the challenges, but do you have any comments on the way that, you know, you and both of you and all the other industry organizations that were at the ministerials, you know, to which extent did you have access to actually provide the input and to influence the agenda there?
Yeah, I want to start by saying here that this was a global effort. We were working with industry associations from across the world, like I said earlier, from developed and developing countries, to ensure that the governments, the WTO members, were prioritizing the extension of the moratorium. This influence operation took many different forms. So, number one, there was a global industry statement that was updated several times leading up into MC13. And I know WITSA signed this, CTA signed it, SIA signed it, but at the end of the day, we had over 211 industry associations and business groups signing this from across the world, including from India, Indonesia, and South Africa, which placed a greater amount of pressure on those governments to you know, perhaps not block this outcome at the end of the day. I think those governments didn't listen to their industries. They had other priorities in mind in the negotiations, but we thought it was quite notable that associations from those countries were on that global industry statement. The other thing that we absolutely had to do was to bring more data to the conversation. And so there were numerous studies generated by economic experts in Indonesia, in South Africa, in India, in other parts of Africa, surveys done of small businesses in Africa and Southeast Asia on what the moratorium is, why it's important, what the impacts would be if the moratorium disappeared, what the tariff revenue would be if countries started putting that into place, if they actually started putting tariffs on cross-border data flows or digital product. And we also tried to create a contrast between what countries could do in terms of collecting revenue through a VAT versus collecting revenue through tariffs on cross-border data flows. And the VAT is a far more effective way to do that. And as a matter of fact, there was a very important paper generated by the World Bank and the IMF in advance of MC13 that said exactly that. And so we tried to undercut the assertion that the moratorium was ending the moratorium was essential for revenue collection purposes. You know, if you, like I said, if you impose, you know, tariffs on cross-border data flows, that's not going to buy you a lot of revenue. As a matter of fact, you're going to separate yourself as a country from the global digital economy. So we did a lot of in-person meetings with officials leading up into MC13. There was an industry meeting in the United States with the White House, just as an example, to ensure that the Biden administration understood the priority that industry placed on extending the moratorium. I think many of our industry association counterparts in other countries also met with their governments to reinforce the extension of the moratorium. I think they used that global industry statement I described as a point of demonstration, and they also used the studies that were generated that I described. We wanted to help people understand that the moratorium is part of the fabric of the multilateral trading system, and most people just take it for granted. Some of the studies generated explicitly said, and this is by the New Markets Lab, Katrin Kuhlmann, who's a Georgetown law professor and a researcher. She did a number of studies, including in South Africa, where they interviewed small businesses and startups about the moratorium and said, well, this is what it is. And most people had never heard of it before. But once they understood what the moratorium was, that it prevented customs duties and electronic transmissions, they said, oh, well, that's really important. If it went away, it would completely devastate my business. And so we tried to build up a grassroots approach to extending the moratorium as well and getting these small businesses and startups to weigh in with their governments. And that's all prior to MC13. And we can talk about what happened on the ground too.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on what Ed was talking about, because the question, Anders, that you asked is, how is industry able to influence the agenda? Well, you can't influence the agenda if you don't even know what it is, if you don't even know what the moratorium is. And so I think that kind of speaks to, certain governments have had very long-standing kind of dug-in positions that the moratorium is bad. But what that particular study that Ed mentioned really brought to light is, it didn't seem like they were really, those governments were really consulting with their industry community to understand if it benefited them, right? There's just been, there's been a number of studies and reports that have come out of think tanks all around the world that take a particular position, but it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of outreach directly to entrepreneurs and startups and small businesses that were looking to grow both, in a domestic market, but then to go global. And so that was really interesting and concerning, and highlights a need for both the global business community, but also national governments, to make sure that they are consulting with their internal stakeholders, so that they understand what's at stake in these global negotiations. Because Geneva is a far off place for many people, including us, and most folks are just trying to make sure that their business is growing, that they're able to pay their workforce, and they're not paying attention to what negotiators are sitting around the table and talking about, on Lake Geneva or in Abu Dhabi. So I think that's something that going forward, I think we all need to be super cognizant of, is making sure that not just, in terms of an advocacy effort, but an education effort globally, so that businesses really understand what's at stake. And then one other point I wanted to make, just about the moratorium, is that, most of the discussion seems to revolve around the idea of putting a tariff on the movement of data or an electronic transmission. But before you can actually impose a tariff on anything, you have to set up a customs administration system to actually track that data. So even before a government might get to the point of saying, okay, we're going to charge 5% on your app download, they need a way to track it. And so that's another layer of administrative burden and red tape that would be really difficult for especially small businesses to manage. Can you imagine if a small business or even a consumer had to fill out an import declaration every time they downloaded an app on their phone? So I think I think that the discussions need to kind of focus on what it would mean in total to remove this agreement, which, as Ed said, really has been the fabric of the global trading system, and it's how the internet economy really grew up. Because the moratorium was first agreed in 1998, before before there really was, or really at the beginning of the digital economy. And so I think people have just taken it for granted, because that's the way the entire the entire digital economy grew up.
Mary, I mean, if we didn't have the moratorium, we might have to pay a tariff on this Zoom right now.
That's right.
Thank you very much, guys. So I'm going to move over to the next section, which is about the outcomes. And we have already started delving into some of the outcomes in your previous remarks. So rather than going one question at a time, let me do the three first questions together, because you have partially covered at least the first one here. So as far as the outcomes is concerned, can you explain the significance of the e-commerce moratorium and its impact of global trade, digital trade? We've already talked to some extent on that. What are the implications of extending the e-commerce moratorium until MC14 or March 31st, 2026? Excuse me, I got a typo in there. Apologize for that. How do the divergent views of the moratorium reflect the broader challenges and opportunities in the international e-commerce policy? What if you take those three questions combined? We have already covered some of these. What really are the implications of the extending the moratorium until the next conference? And how do these divergent views on the moratorium reflect the broader challenges and opportunities in e-commerce policy?
Anders, maybe let me jump in and just talk about the significance of the moratorium for the semiconductor industry and why you know, I mentioned that data is important, but let me go a little bit deeper to give a better sense of the significance of this for the semiconductor sector. So every step in our value chain involves the transmission of data. The semiconductor supply chain is super complex, but you know, from semiconductor design, which is done using software, to wafer manufacturing, to the back end assembly, test, and packaging of a chip, there's transmission of data. If you think about just chip design, that's a massive undertaking to design the very intricate circuitry at, you know, super small scale. It involves engineering teams that can span across multiple countries, and that design data, because those teams are in disparate places, that design data can cross borders hundreds, maybe even thousands of times just in the design development phase. And then when you think about a country like India, India's home to 20% of the world's semiconductor design workforce. A number of our member companies, semiconductor companies, have had research and design operations in India since the 1980s. And so that's why it was a little bit baffling for us that India was one of those governments that was advocating for ending the moratorium. But then let's move from the design phase to you know, after that semiconductor design is finished, it's handed off to a manufacturing or a fabrication facility. And that design data is transferred across a border in what's called a GDS, or a graphical data system file. And then during the manufacturing process, huge amounts of data are generated and collected at every step in multiple production areas, with data coming from that wafer fab back to the company that might have contracted that design to be made. At the probe and testing phase, when you're testing different parts of a wafer to see if the circuits are working as intended, when that wafer is assembled and done the final test, there's data crossing borders all the time in the course of that production. And so for us, you know, our companies were asking, okay, what would it mean for if the moratorium went away and we were having our companies would have to file customs declarations for the movement of that data that is really constant. And then, you know, the idea of putting a tariff on the top of that was quite concerning for people to wrap their hands around. And again, you know, hard to understand why a government that is actively looking to attract an investment and build out a domestic ecosystem, why they would want to impose those types of burdens on the industry. So really the extension of the moratorium was incredibly important for us, but concerning in the way it was extended, that it has this sort of finality that it will go away by March 31st, 2026. And I think there's been some suggestions by some at the WTO that this really is it, that it will not be extended past that time. And I hope that's not the case. And I'll say from the SIA perspective, we will continue to advocate for continued extension of the moratorium. And as I said at the beginning, we should really be talking about making this a permanent fixture so that it's not a topic of debate every 2 years at the ministerial.
Just to build on that, Mary, I mean, Anders, I know that's a typo, but I really wish the moratorium had been extended to 20,261. Maybe we will still, humanity will be around by then, but it would be a very sound policy. But, just to also build on what Mary said, we're in this great era of supply chain diversification, and it's very apparent in the semiconductor industry, but also the consumer technology industry. So many companies are trying to find new sourcing opportunities in different parts of the world to be closer to their customers, to reduce transportation distances, to lower their costs, to create more certainty. And India, Indonesia, they're both part of that. Other Southeast Asian countries are part of that. And so if we're going to eliminate the moratorium and then countries can start imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions, that is going to make that supply chain diversification far more costly. And those countries that do impose those customs duties are going to cut themselves out of the supply chain diversification phenomenon. So they will just create a more autarkic situation for their economies. In the internet, the digital economy will become far more fragmented, segmented, and more costly for consumers. So the implications of extending the e-commerce moratorium the next 2 years, we have 2 more years now of advocacy to find a permanent solution to this challenge. So in an ideal world, we would have another multilateral extension of the moratorium. It seems that a lot of governments don't want to pay the price to India and others for their hostage taking anymore. That to us is quite clear. But we think it's still in the WTO's interest to have a multilateral extension of the moratorium, even if the language in the decision says that the moratorium and the work program on e-commerce are supposed to expire by March 31st or MC13 in 2026. Ministers could completely decide that they do want to extend it. We are also trying to advocate for a permanent moratorium in the joint statement initiative negotiations on e-commerce, which is a plurilateral set of negotiations. They're almost at their conclusion. We hope that could be a leading negotiation for the WTO that then could be extended into a multilateral context. But none of this is certain, and we have a lot more work to do between now and MC14 in Cameroon in 2 years.
Thank you very much. So let's move on. So in what ways can the e-commerce decision aid in bridging the digital divide for developing and least developed countries? And what are their concerns regarding the potential foregone customs revenue due to the moratorium and how they can be addressed? I know we touched upon the fallacy that the revenue is essential to ending the moratorium, and you could have reverse implications for the economy. So how does this affect the least developed and the developing countries, and what impact would the going away of the moratorium have on the digital divide? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I'll start. So what was very interesting to us in the lead up to MC13 is that the developing countries, particularly the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific group of developing countries, expressed a very strong preference for extension of the moratorium. There was an ACP, African, Caribbean, and Pacific country group paper a proposal actually to extend the moratorium, because I think that group of developing countries understood that the moratorium is beneficial to their integration into the global digital economy and also to their startups and small businesses, who therefore would not have to face customs duties if they're trying to export their service or their product or their app or whatever in other countries. So they also expressed a strong preference for creating a much stronger development dimension in the e-commerce work program. And so if you read the decision that was agreed to by ministers, you could see that development dimension being very much more prominent now compared to past declarations or statements by ministers on e-commerce. So we think this is incredibly important, and over the next 2 years, helping the developing countries take advantage of that work program and participate in it, and also not just assuming that they're going to. We can't just assume that they're going to stand up for extension of the moratorium again. As industry, we have to, again, help them make the case for extension of the moratorium with their own governments continually over the next 2 years. Because I think the MC14, because it's in Cameroon, is going to have a very strong development dimension that's almost even particular to Africa and LDCs and developing countries in Africa as well. And I think we've touched upon the issue on potential foregone customs revenue, having a capacity building approach to this in the WTO to help the developing countries understand that there are other tools they could use in their toolbox, like a VAT tax, a value-added tax, as opposed to tariffs on cross-border data flows that would be better suited for revenue generation and more transparent.
Yeah, and maybe just to pick up on the topic of foregone revenue, this was a topic that also came up in the context of information technology agreement negotiations, and this idea that, well, if we join for developing countries, if they were to join the ITA, they would be giving up the tariff revenue from importing those goods. But if you look at where where technology sort of grown up, where these ecosystems have actually been located, they have largely been located since the 1990s in countries that joined the Information Technology Agreement, because there is so much when there's no barriers to importing the tech goods, it makes it easier to get technology in the hands of students, in the hands of small business, and that ability to access these technologies really helps to drive economic growth across an economy, and so it's really that development, growth, and investment that's foregone, and that's what it sort of needs to be measured against. Like, what are you gaining when you give up that tariff revenue? And for many developing countries, it's they've gained access for their population to cheaper, more powerful technologies that they can use to drive their businesses forward. From even in the agriculture sector. So really, it's not, if you measure those two things against each other, and there's a think tank in DC, the Information Technology and Innovation Forum, that's done a lot of research on this topic, and actually found that the tariff revenue argument is actually it's the benefits far outweigh what a government would be giving up.
Thank you very much, Mary. As a matter of fact, we have Dr. Robert Atkinson from the ITF participating in a webinar later this month. We're going to talk about some of the myths and the misinformation regarding a slew of topics, including trade, and I'm sure we'll be touching on that then as well.
Yes, he would know a lot about this topic.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's move on. The final questions on the outcomes of the Ministerial 13 before we move for the final segment, which will be the road to 14. So these questions here are more concerning generally on the work program on electronic commerce. So let me ask the three questions together. I think they can probably be covered together. So first, how do you assess the industry's reaction to the outcomes of the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference, particularly regarding the ministerial decision on the work program on electronic commerce? And what impact do you foresee the ministerial decision will have on the ongoing joint statement initiative negotiations? And what impact do you foresee that this decision will have on global e-commerce and additional trade more broadly? Ed, would you have any comments on that?
Well, our reaction to the outcomes was, well, number one, relief that the moratorium has been extended, great relief. But also, I think given the difficulty of the negotiations where you had several WTO members just not really not taking a good faith approach to the negotiations and taking hostages left and right to secure completely unrelated outcomes. And actually, they were very unsuccessful in their tactics, by the way. We're very concerned about the viability of the WTO negotiating process going forward. If this movie is going to be played in sequel at every single ministerial conference going forward. So we think that there should be a better approach for the ministerial negotiations in the future so that we don't end up in these last minute situations where we don't know if the priority is actually going to be achieved. So I would say on the ministerial decision on the work program on electronic commerce, we really liked what we saw because for the first time, the moratorium and the work program are linked together. So if the moratorium disappears, the work program also disappears. So we feel that that gives the countries who have an incentive in the work program an incentive to also advocate for extension of the moratorium. So that linkage is incredibly important from our perspective, and hopefully that will lead to a more productive set of discussions for MC14. However, we do think that some of the countries that we mentioned, like India, Indonesia, and South Africa, don't really care about the work program, and they just prefer to kill the moratorium no matter what.
Yeah, just to echo Ed, certainly a big sigh of relief that the moratorium lived to fight another day. But really, I think continued concern that we may only have 2 years left. I think shortly after the ministerial concluded, I mentioned this earlier, Dr. Ngozi said publicly, like, that's it, guys. This was the last time. I'm not really sure why she would have said that. Let us all celebrate for a little bit. But I think it was a warning that this we're going to have this fight again. And so that's as Ed said, for us in the business community and the stakeholder community, our job is really to continue educating governments and industry around the world why this is so important and the downsides of it going away. So that's where we will be focused over the next 2 years. Again, for our industry, just making the case for why the moratorium is important for our supply chains, and to governments that want a piece of our industry and want our companies to come set up shop in their countries. Well, this is table stakes. You can't be talking about imposing a customs regime on data flows and adding more costs to the movement of that data. That's going to disincentivize investors from even looking at a country. Mm-hmm. So we've got a tough job ahead of us. But I think we're very dedicated and focused on making sure that our own government and others really understand the importance of this, and can will be open to hearing our voices. I think that's also a key. And I think the WTO has an opportunity to maybe pull the business community more into the discussions in Geneva. They hold an annual public forum, which SIA and our members participate in regularly, and I think I always see Ed there and other associations from around the world. But it'd be great if that wasn't just an annual affair. I think that the WTO is at its most vibrant, and the debate is the most enlightening when you've got stakeholders there as part of the discussion, and it's not just kind of governments only talking to governments. Geneva is a little bit of a bubble, and I think we need to pop that bubble.
I totally agree, Mary. I mean, when we were negotiators at USTR, I always appreciated industry showing up and telling us about their thoughts on what we were working on, because in absence of that, we're just creating policy in a vacuum. And when you're not talking to your stakeholders and understanding their perspectives, that policy might not be very sound, and that whatever negotiating outcome you achieve might not be responsive to their needs and interests. So, Anders, the second question here, in rereading it, I almost think it's in the reverse. I'll flip it around. That the JSI negotiations will have an impact on the work program, because the JSI negotiations are almost at their conclusion. There are really important provisions in there concerning digital trade facilitation, like on e-signatures, on digital documentation. I mean, there's a range of things on privacy and cybersecurity, like a range of things that are going to be very important for the work program, because you have to remember the work program is multilateral, the JSI is plurilateral. So for all those WTO members who don't participate in the JSI, once those negotiations are concluded or substantially concluded, they're going to learn more about what those provisions are and why they could be meaningful for them. But one thing I'll say on the JSI is that we are, as an industry, and I think many other associations in the United States would agree with us, very disappointed that the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative withdrew its support for previous proposals it made on things like prohibiting data localization requirements, or prohibiting restrictions on cross-border data flows, or non-discriminatory treatment of digital product, or conditions that the governments might impose on market access in relation to source code. So these are all incredibly important to the digital economy, and if the United States government isn't willing to move these forward in the negotiations, they may never be addressed in the e-commerce JSI, and we want the United States government to return to the table with robust negotiating positions to get that done. And I don't know if it's going to happen in this administration, but the USTR needs to come back to the table and not just abandon these provisions like it did in October of last year.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I think we're already now firmly in the last segment, which is the outcomes. But just before I move on to the last set of questions, on the JSI, what is your thoughts on, regardless of what the future looks like for the moratorium in the wider WTO setting, and certainly we as an industry have been pushing hard for making the moratorium permanent through the joint statement, a plurilateral, future agreement, hopefully. What is your assessment of how likely that is going to be included in the final JSI negotiating framework?
So I think there's a strong likelihood of a moratorium on e-commerce, the customs duties and electronic transmissions appearing in the JSI final outcome. There are some governments who don't want to make it permanent. There are some governments who may not sign on to the outcomes at the end of the day. So it's a little bit unclear at this point, but I think there are strong advocates for making it permanent amongst the co-conveners of the JSI, and then certainly amongst other participants. And we are also going to be working very hard with our fellow associations on ensuring that JSI moratorium is as clear as possible.
Thank you so much, Ed. So, okay, so just to the last few questions. So, on the road to MC14, what are some of the main challenges and opportunities identified by the industry following MC13 outcomes? And what are the industry's expectations or priorities for the upcoming MC14 in relation to e-commerce? We've already covered some ground on this. We talked about the trade priorities. We talked about industry should make a greater effort of being present at the WTO, and we talked about other things. But do you have anything else to add in terms of industry's expectations and priorities for the upcoming 14, or do we have that covered sufficiently?
As I said at the beginning, I would love to see the WTO get back in the business of breaking down barriers to trade, and not having this debate, not having the moratorium being at the center of the negotiations at the next ministerial conference. There are so many other issues and challenges facing the trading community today, and national communities today that trade has a role in fixing or addressing. And so, I mentioned looking at bringing more countries into the information technology agreement, the ITA 1 and ITA 2. We're going to continue doing that, and that you'll continue to hear the drumbeat from SIA and others to encourage that. There's been some important wins on that front. So Laos joined the ITA in the last couple of years. There's some others, and now the names are escaping me, but
Timor-Leste.
Timor-Leste. Thank you, Ed. We're very hopeful that Vietnam will look to join the ITA 2. They're in ITA 1, but they didn't join ITA 2. And ITA 2 eliminates tariffs on a number of manufacturing equipment and inputs and components important to the semiconductor industry. And so that's going to continue to be a priority for us. We'd love to see more products added to the ITA. And so we'd like to see the ITA committee and the ITA expansion committee at the WTO focus on that. And there's built-in provisions to those agreements that would allow them to do that without launching a big new agreement, which we know is hard. But we'd like to see the WTO do more things that are of interest and will create positive results for the trading community.
I fully agree with that, Mary. The agenda for the WTO has become ever more limited in terms of the types of issues that are being negotiated on at ministerial conferences. Compared to what we were doing in the Doha round, which was quite expansive, and there was a very strong offensive agenda that, of course, was diminished over time. And that's probably a topic for another webinar, Anders. But an offensive agenda where there's robust negotiations on many different topics would be incredibly helpful. And I fully agree with Mary that adding more countries to ITA 1 and 2, more accessions, expanding the product coverage would be tremendously helpful for the global supply chain diversification phenomenon. Some of the countries that are not part of ITA 1 and 2 won't be able to participate in that phenomenon unless they actually exceed. And so we'd like to see those accessions take place sooner rather than later. And I'll add another country to the list. We heard this week that the government of Jordan is close to making a decision on joining ITA 2.
Oh, that's great.
And if they do, we need to celebrate that in a big way,
Yes.
because that's a country taking a positive step forward to open their market, to facilitate more investment and more integration globally, and we need to make a big deal out of announcements like those. I'd love to see Brazil take a closer look at joining ITA. Mexico. Big, huge markets that I'll say, at least for Brazil, a huge consumer market, but not much happening there in the way of tech manufacturing, and that could change overnight if their government took another look at their tariff structure.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, so we have already answered, I think, our next question was all around the ITAA. How was the ITA contributed to the growth of the global technology industry since its inception, and what are its current limitations? And what ways can the ITA be reformed to better foster innovation and support developing countries' participation in the tech industry? We already talked about some of the importance of this, which that countries that are not participating, especially in ITA 1, but even more countries are not in ITA 2. We talked about certainly it would be great to even look at expanding ITA into an ITA 3, although there is so much ground to cover already with ITA 1 and 2. So any more final thoughts about how the ITA can be best reformed to support developing countries' participation in tech industry before we move on to the final question? Or are we already covered?
Well, I think that incorporating more developing countries into the conversations at the ITA committee and the ITA expansion committee it's incredibly important, and working with the developing country groups in Geneva and other institutions in Geneva that work with developing countries. So like the International Trade Center or UNCTAD, because they have their own relationships with the developing country representatives in Geneva and in capitals. So I think you could have a very robust program on ITA and developing countries that takes place over time, but we need to get these conversations rebooted now that we're past MC13.
Yeah, and I'll just say that the WTO Secretariat is fantastic. They do fantastic work and can help developing countries take a closer look at their tariff schedule and understand what it would actually take to join. But that's demand driven. So they're not just going to go out to an individual developing country and say, hey, have you thought about joining the ITA today? Governments need to proactively go into the WTO Secretariat and say, hey, can you help us out with this? And they will do it. And I will tell you that the WTO Secretariat has a crack staff in their market access division and beyond. And they could be very helpful in this regard.
All right. Thank you so much. So let's move on to the very last slide here. So 2 questions towards at the end of this. So how should the WTO balance the development dimension with the commercial interest of various industries in the e-commerce discussions? And what strategies should industry adopt to influence the future negotiations on e-commerce at the WTO? Any final thoughts of that before we conclude the webinar?
I'll just say, Anders, I think the premise of the question kind of suggests that the development dimension and commercial interests are mutually exclusive, and they are not. I think more commercial activity is in the interest and will help to drive development. So I think it's thinking about how to frame some of the discussions differently, because I think that's been one of the challenges at the WTO. The discussions there often get very politicized and pit these ideas one against each other when actually they're not really in conflict. So I think having more business activity, having more business friendly policies and trade regulations in a country is not anti-development, it's pro-development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Ed, do you have any final thoughts on this?
I would agree with Mary that we've always advocated for more open approaches to trade and investment to enable development. And I think that was the entire premise of the Doha development agenda. Not that we want to revive that, but there is a logic to creating more opportunities for trade and investment to drive development. And so they are very interlinked. And if we cut off trade, if we end the moratorium, that's not good for development. That's not good for developing countries. And I think many of the developing countries that we work with do understand that. And I think that there's a big difference between the developing countries and LDCs whose economies are a lot smaller, and the big developing countries like India, Indonesia, and South Africa who are advocating for termination of the moratorium for whatever reason. Maybe it's revenue generation, maybe it's protectionism. But it's clear to us that there's a split in the developing country world, and those voices are not monolithic.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, WITSA as well, for been around for a while, and we have always, in all the years that I've been in WITSA, this has been one of our central messages that we have been trying to advocate, which is that development comes as a result of promoting a business-friendly environment. I mean, how can you grow and develop your country if you don't develop your business and your industry? I mean, these two cannot be separated. This has been something we have been pushing for a very long time. So I full-heartedly agree with both of your assessments here. So just see, I don't know if we have any questions from the panelists, if of the people on the here. Otherwise, I think we are finished. Anyone have any questions for the panelists before we conclude? I think we're all set. So Ed, thanks again very much, and Mary, thank you so much. Doug, as the policy chairman for WITSA, do you have any final comments before we round up this webinar?
No, I think it was a terrific discussion. It's certainly very important to industry and economic growth, and it's also very timely at this point in 2024, knowing that many countries around the world are also holding elections this year. So leadership on this at many levels is super important. Thanks to both of you, Mary and Ed.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Anders. Thank you, Dan. Really pleasure to speak with the WITSA audience.
Thank you
so
very
much,
much.
everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.